Peace talks are underway once again in Afghanistan, and NATO forces may soon be withdrawn as the Taliban resumes a role in government. I'd like to offer a few thoughts on recent military operations in Afghanistan, both those of the Soviet armed forces and NATO. Neither was successful, and I believe they failed largely for the same reasons. In 2001, while serving in the Ministry of Defence, I participated in the Strategic Planning Group, which considered the UK response to the attacks of September the 11th in the United States, attacks which ultimately resulted in the decision to deploy armed forces into Afghanistan. In 2006, I deployed to Afghanistan to establish and command the UK Joint Helicopter Force in Helmand Province. In preparing for both of these roles, it was natural to read the lessons of history, which included 3 unsuccessful British imperial interventions, as well as the Soviet experience, which had been well documented by senior Soviet officers. From 2011 to 2016, I then served as the UK Defence Attaché in Moscow, which afforded an opportunity to discuss both Afghan conflicts, Soviet and American-led, with those who had participated. I have, thus, a personal and professional perspective on conflict in Afghanistan. In this presentation, I will briefly survey the causes for failure in both cases in order to better understand the demands of operations outside of total war and the value of alternate courses of action. Both operations ran for inordinately long periods, 10 and 20 years respectively, yet the threat from Nazi Germany, a technologically developed force operating in total war over all 3 domains, land, sea and air, was defeated in 4 years, from 1941 to 1945. The USSR lost around 15,000 soldiers in Afghanistan, and more than 3,500 NATO personnel have died. In all, at least 1.5 million Afghans are believed to have been killed or wounded during both the 2 interventions. Washington alone has spent close to $1 trillion on the conflict. Both were wars of choice, discretionary operations. Neither served the intended purpose. Most importantly, it is not my wish to question the courage or integrity of the many soldiers who fought in Afghanistan, but only to better understand the causes of their sacrifice and to ensure the mistakes that rendered them pointless are not repeated. The decision to use force is a serious one, too often made for the wrong reasons, with too little understanding of the costs and consequences. It is time to learn from that bitter experience. First, I would like to consider the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. Accounts of the period in late 1979 vary, but suggest that the decision to deploy military force was taken by a small group of political figures without proper reference to the leading military strategists available to them. According to Deputy Foreign Minister Georgy Kononenko, only 5 Politburo members made the decision: Brezhnev, Andropov, Ustinov, Gromyko and Suslov. There can be no better summary of their deliberations than that later formulated by the Russian General Staff. When the highest political leaders of the USSR sent its forces into this war, they did not consider the historic, religious and national particularities of Afghanistan. The military view of intervention was unequivocal. Chief of the Soviet General Staff, Nikolai Ogarkov, for whom these readings are named, presented his thoughts prior to the Politburo meeting on December 12, 1979. He advised that military intervention in Afghanistan would be impossible and inconceivable, first and foremost from the political standpoint. The Defence Minister, Dmitry Ustinov, dismissed the argument, telling the military strategist not to discuss orders and to present a detailed plan of the operation. When he repeated his warning on December 9th in Brezhnev's presence, saying that we will turn all of Eastern Islam against ourselves and lose politically across the world, he was silenced by Andropov. You are invited not to have your opinion heard, but to write down the Politburo's directives and organise their implementation. The commander of Soviet ground forces, General of the Army Ivan Pavlovsky, visited Afghanistan over the period from August to November 1979. He concluded that Soviet troops should not be sent there, citing 7 reasons not to intervene militarily in a report he sent to Ustinov. These were the lack of support for the socialist revolution, the lack of a developed working class, the mass belief in Islam, widespread possession of weapons, porous borders, strong resistance to foreign intervention, and the resulting deterioration in relations with the US and NATO. He was dismissed from post before the campaign began. In 1994, General Garyaev published an article criticising the Soviet political leadership for ignoring Ogarkov's views and telling him to stick to military planning. As life has repeatedly proved, political decisions prove viable and grounded only when they take into account all aspects, including foreign policy, economic, ideological and military strategic considerations. He added, the General Staff cannot determine policies, but they must actively participate in crafting military aspects of this policy, and ignoring these aspects can lead to major political failures. A variety of justifications for interventions were considered by the country's leadership, such as ensuring the survival of Moscow's allies and maintaining the alignment of neighbouring states. Ustinov identified the need to support the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which had come to power in April 1978. General Secretary Taraki had subsequently been assassinated by his rival Hafizullah Amin, who took over as the leader and president of what became the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Amin, it was believed, was more likely to seek a rapprochement with the West. If the US were to establish a foothold in the country, they would be able to collect telemetry during launches of newly designed Russian missiles and even target those facilities in times of conflict. The Politburo did see some costs to an intervention. Less than a year earlier, when the Afghan government had asked Moscow for help against an uprising in Herat, Foreign Minister Gromyko told fellow Politburo members that the Soviet army would be branded an aggressor if it deployed into Afghanistan, and that it would have to first and foremost fight the Afghan people. Andropov apparently agreed. The Politburo concluded that troops should not be sent. Many observers have blamed the subsequent decision to intervene on Brezhnev's personal desire to take revenge for the assassination of Taraki. His agitation was confirmed by his personal physician, Yevgeny Chazov, who reported, in spite of the decline of his ability for critical perception, he took that event very much to heart. He quoted him as saying, "What will they say in other countries? How can one trust Brezhnev's word if his assurances of support and protection remain just words?" Once deployed, the folly of ignoring military advice was self-evident and formed a deeply unstable foundation on which to develop a military campaign. Orders for the military contingent were ambiguous, beyond the direction to replace Amin. They failed to define what would constitute success once the initial goal of regime change had been achieved. As a consequence, commanders did not have clear metrics to determine whether the intervention was succeeding, failing, or stagnating, other than by measuring how much territory the DRA controlled at any time. As would prove the case for the US intervention, this was not enough. The military directive issued on December 24, 1979, gave only a vague idea of why troops were being sent into Afghanistan. It said, to give international aid to the friendly Afghan people, and also to create favourable conditions to interdict possible anti-Afghan actions from neighbouring countries. General Garyaev observed, as strange as it may sound, from the very beginning of the introduction of troops and until the end of their stay in Afghanistan, there was no clear line on whether our troops in this country should fight or not. He noted that the lack of a clear goal and a definite plan of action had a direct impact on military operations. There was neither a definite political, strategic plan, nor an integral concept of the use of troops in Afghanistan from the very beginning and, in essence, until the very end of the campaign. Once forces were deployed, reports from the theatre of operations were distorted to meet the expectations of political leadership. Colonel Nikolai Vasilyev, in an article published in 2014, describes a familiar picture from accounts of both conflicts. The intelligence and other agencies were required to confirm the sagacity of the leader, and the information and recommendations of analysts and experts that did not fit into the pre-planned framework were thrown away. The lack of clarity led to the task being redefined by evolving circumstances, not by a coherent strategy. According to General Gromov, it is impossible to make a country like Afghanistan, with its completely different way of life, with its different religion, low level of development, a country that lives in its 14th century according to its own calendar, similar to the Soviet Union. It would be a real absurdity. Our own experience in Afghanistan in February 2006 was not so different. It was clear that the NATO operation was also suffering from the consequences of its poorly considered origins. For example, in the absence of strategic clarity, the US Helicopter Task Force in Helmand Province was using daily ammunition consumption as a metric of success. But activity is not success. Firepower is not strategy. It seemed as though the trauma of September 2001 had the effect of making the US forget the lessons of Vietnam. Soon after our arrival in theatre, 2 senior officers visited from the UK Permanent Joint Headquarters, the National Command Authority for Deployed Forces. They directed that no aircraft were to be lost or damaged, on the ground or in the air. Absolutely no losses, no risks were to be taken. An inconceivable constraint. When the senior UK national officer in Helmand Province deployed to oversee operations in the region, we were directed to cease all flying in support of our coalition partners. Henceforth, we were only to fly in support of British units. At this point it was clear that we were not only lacking a strategy, we were lacking a coalition. The decision taken in Washington to deploy force into Afghanistan in 2001 was driven by outrage at the attacks on mainland America by Al-Qaeda and their choice of safe haven in ungoverned spaces in Afghanistan. It repeated many of the mistakes of the Politburo. Washington was motivated by the need to ensure that allies and foes alike had no doubts as to US resolve to defend itself and its interests. The chosen course of action was not moderated by allies who were less emotionally driven by the attacks. In London, initial planning in the Ministry of Defence, which recommended not attacking Afghanistan, was waved off with direction to determine what the Americans needed and deliver it. This was not only an abdication of national defence and foreign policy in favour of the demands of a dominant alliance partner, but failed to meet the reasonable requirement for an ally to provide clear-sighted advice, working in concert with, not in subjugation to, a stronger partner. It was a critical failure in a country with extensive experience in the region, and in Afghanistan in particular. Extensive research conducted by SIGAR, the Office of the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, has created a considerable record of observations on the subsequent operation, chronicling the lack of clarity and direction, a lack of strategy or effective metrics to measure the effectiveness of the campaign. There are considerable echoes of the Soviet experience throughout the surveys conducted of participating officers, but those of Lieutenant General Lute, a senior advisor to US administrations throughout the campaign, will suffice to summarise the overall view. We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing, he added. What are we trying to do here? We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking. If the American people knew the magnitude of this dysfunction, 2,400 lives lost, who will say this was in vain? The commitment, once made, became difficult to report honestly, and even more difficult to curtail. Every data point was altered to present the best possible picture. Colonel Robert Crowley, a counterinsurgency advisor in 2002-2014, told his interviewers, truth was very rarely welcome at military headquarters in Kabul. Bad news was often stifled, he said. There was more freedom to share bad news if it was small, but when we tried to air larger strategic concerns about the willingness, capacity or corruption of the Afghan government, it was clear it wasn't welcome. John Sopko, the head of SIGAR, said bluntly, the American people have been constantly lied to. President George W. Bush, in a speech at the Virginia Military Institute, promised, the history of military conflict in Afghanistan has been one of initial success, followed by long years of floundering and ultimate failure. We're not going to repeat that mistake. History has made it abundantly clear that we did. Reasons for failure were many and complex in both cases, but were largely rooted in the decision to deploy force without clarity of purpose. Both decisions were made without an understanding of the nature of the conflict, the strategy required to deliver a positive effect, or a realistic appraisal of the resources necessary to achieve success. Both were made by a group which was overly narrow in its expertise and driven to achieve objectives which ultimately lay outside of Afghanistan. In the absence of meaningful intelligence or the will to consider alternate policies, both were unrealistic militarily, culturally and politically. In both operations, self-deception bordered on hubris. Entry was easy, unopposed and conducted against non-state actors. In the early days, when the informal structures of the opposition were unable to mobilise and popular opinion had yet to coalesce against the invader, successes were readily attainable, be it the assassination of a national leader or the seizure of territory. As both operations gradually lost momentum and stagnated, honesty in accounting for the expenditure of life and resources was abandoned. Distorted figures, willfully false reporting, and creating an illusion of success during transient periods in command are a common criticism in investigations into both conflicts. Manipulating opinion in capital cities, not fighting a war on the ground, was the priority. In the case of the NATO operation, it was clear from the outset that the number of forces required to succeed in tactical engagements could not be met, as it was politically unacceptable to deploy such large numbers of troops. Instead, improved technology, precision fires, enhanced coordination, improved air and ground mobility, rapid rates of response, complex intelligence gathering, and improved targeting would, it was assumed, compensate. NATO forces did not, in practice, have those things in sufficient measure, even if they could have served that purpose. In failing to analyse the kind of war they would be undertaking, national leaderships, political and military, ensured that the wrong forces would be deployed with inadequate tactics and equipment. They failed to appreciate the resolve of the population to oppose alien occupation. Motivation, particularly amongst Afghan allies, was central to success or failure. As Napoleon framed it, in war the moral is to the physical as 10 to 1. Within the population, the insurgents were understood to be righteous, defending their country, religion and honour. Those Afghan nationals who sided with the intervention forces were not. They were seen as the agents of a corrupt government supporting a foreign invader. Evidence of this perception and its effects were clear in the tendency of many Afghan units, once trained, equipped and deployed, to defect, submit or flee, even when in a tactically superior position. What took place beyond the porous borders of Afghanistan also shaped the conflict. When the Soviet 40th Army deployed, US support to their opponents under Operation Cyclone was valued at $695,000 a year. By 1987, it had reached $630 million a year. The ability to harbour and develop forces in Pakistan was never prevented. Ironically, the forces brought to bear against NATO found safe haven and logistic support in the same places. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia were fundamental to cause and conflict, but this remained an issue which was never directly assessed. The disloyalty of regional allies was an unacceptable truth. Both Soviet and NATO armies were largely fighting blind. The absence of reliable, timely and verifiable intelligence led to deception by allies in Afghanistan, who frequently directed fire to resolve local rivalries rather than the intended insurgent targets. The consequences were catastrophic, alienating the population and driving them to support the opposition. What was referred to as collateral damage by NATO became a major contribution to losing the war. The United States failed largely because of the inability to understand Afghan society. It remained for decades ignoring failure, largely because of the potentially catastrophic effect another terrorist attack would have on electoral politics in the USA. Once committed, they could not win, but could not afford to lose. A number of recommendations emerge from considering these two interventions in Afghanistan. They relate principally to the decision to conduct warfare and follow lines which have been well established since Karl von Clausewitz served in the Russian Imperial Army. Before deciding on military operations, determine what national interests are at stake, what options exist for advancing or defending those interests, and what costs and benefits each of these options would generate, both direct and indirect. Personal ambitions or emotions must never impact the decision. Ensure a comprehensive review of potential decisions to use force beyond those who would be inclined by position or self-interest to support it. It is critical to understand the society, culture, values and history of your opponent, not just in your own terms, but in theirs. To understand their motivation and conviction. The understanding required will not lie in political or senior military circles. It must be sought from outside, in spite of security concerns or the need to safeguard planning. Establish policy and develop a coherent strategy which can be assessed and progress measured toward a clearly defined end state. Understand the role of politics and its primacy in conflict, and negotiate with opposition elements from the outset. The conduct of war is not an end. It is only an act of coercion intended to drive the negotiation, an expression of will. In summary, the cause of failure in military intervention in Afghanistan between 1979 and the present were manifold, but largely born out of a failure to understand the lessons of the past or to adhere to the widely accepted doctrine. These were exacerbated by a lack of humility required by policymakers to accept contrary views and the honesty to rectify mistakes once committed. As Clausewitz put it, the first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that a statesman and commander has to make is to establish the kind of war on which they are embarking. He also said, war is the realm of uncertainty, war is the realm of chance. Two qualities are indispensable. First, an intellect that, even in the darkest hour, retains some glimmerings of the inner light which leads to truth. And second, the courage to follow this faint light wherever it may lead. There can be little excuse for US and NATO officers, particularly the British, whose history in the region is extensive, failing to consider the experience of those who had preceded them into Afghanistan. Financially, it is ruinous. Morally, it is wicked. Militarily, it is an open question. And politically, it is a blunder. Churchill wrote these lines in 1897, when, as a young cavalry officer, he found himself fighting the forefathers of the contemporary Taliban. How little we have learnt.